So in this segment, we're going to be talking about the Suez Canal crisis, and so it's been delayed project, but it's here now. So it's a very long video. So have some tea and enjoy. So an overview of the Suez crisis. So let's discuss what the Suez Canal is. It's a huge man-made canal that cuts through Egypt that was built in 1869 through French and Egyptian efforts. I could not find too many reliable sources on how much time is saved by the Suez Canal. From what I've read, it could be between 7 and 10 days according to Transport Geography, or 3 days according to Quora. I think it means 7 to 10 days maybe back in the day when the canal was first built. That would make more sense because transport ships were not as good. Before we talk about the crisis, it's important to discuss some of the context around the state of the UK, France, and the ownership company of the canal. We'll discuss this more from the British perspective. French people can fight me or make their own damn video. So just for context, there's a picture of the canal. It's not the best picture. I did have a look around, but you can kind of see it cuts straight through Egypt. You've got a big pool of water here, and then you've got it just narrows out. But you can see it cuts straight through, and it saves people days on travel, which is a huge saving for transport companies if you think how much labour cost goes into running a ship. So context, the canal was owned by the Suez Company. This was before the Suez Canal crisis. 10% of the annual profits were reserved for the founders, 15% of the annual profits were reserved for the government of Egypt, and 75% of the annual profits were reserved for the shareholders, according to Wikipedia. Now, I could not find an accurate breakdown of how much of the shares were owned by the British and the French governments, but it looks like they owned the majority of shares, as until the Suez crisis happened, the British and French governments ran the canal. So if we look at the importance of the canal, the fall of the Ottoman Empire meant that large parts of their former empire were given to the UK and France via the League of Nations mandate programme. The League of Nations is not to be confused with the League of Legends, which is something I've done in the past. It gave France and the UK effectively, it left France and the UK effectively in charge of these countries without allowing them to be officially added to the British or French empires. Now, the UK was given control of Egypt. However, Egypt gained independence in 1922. However, many of these countries, including Egypt, had typically puppet leaders or ones that were very favourable to Western nations. Now, the canal was important to the UK because of the amount of trade the UK did with countries in Asia, and countries like Australia and New Zealand going through the canal made sense. The Suez Company reflects that, as it was very profitable with a diverse portfolio. The Suez Canal also gave the UK and France a lot of power. Mussolini credits the former two countries with keeping the canal open, otherwise the Italian invasion of Abyssinia would have failed. The reason the canal was kept open was that Mussolini would side with the Allies instead he joined the Axis powers, but that was the hope of it. Despite the empires mostly dissolving post-World War II with India declaring independence in 1947, there was still the idea the UK would keep trading with formerly colonised countries. The Commonwealth still exists today, and some Brexiteers believe that we could just go back to doing lots of trade with Commonwealth countries, but the issue is that model was dying. Geography is a huge problem. So looking at post-World War II Britain, the UK was not doing well. We were in a lot of debt to the Americans. Attlee started up the NHS, which was good, but the UK needed a lot of borrowing to help fund the NHS. Rationing did not fully end until 1954. The UK was very much in decline. However, the UK was given a prominent role on the world stage. So if we have a look at this picture, the big three were seen as the USSR, former Soviet Union, the US and the UK. Despite the UK not doing great domestically, we still saw ourselves as a superpower, but we were not. That's important to remember. And if you look at this picture, you've got the three nations here. You've got the UK, the US, and Big Joseph Big Joseph Stalin. Sorry, there's a picture of him where he looked a bit like one of the Super Mario characters. The crisis. July 26th, 1956, Nasser, who was the then leader of Egypt, the dictator of Egypt, gave the order to seize the canal, catching everyone by surprise. Lieutenant Colonel Nasser was his full rank, but he became the dictator in 1952. He was a known socialist, but kept Egypt neutral during the Cold War and played the two superpowers off each other, so essentially got them to compete for Egypt's loyalty, in a sense. Now, Nasser took something the British and French were very reliant on. You can argue about if what he did was right or wrong, but at the end of the day, he paid the shareholders back what their shares were worth at the end of the day, or so he claimed. But those shares wouldn't be worth a lot given that he took it by force. It was a very hostile takeover. The canal still benefits Egypt via the taxes on cargo and, of course, the world as a giant shortcut for trade. There are lots of tariffs on the canal route which Egypt benefits from massively. The UK's response. So the UK were mad, of course we were. Not only was the canal vital for trade, but given that the idea of the empire was still not fully dead, how dare a non-white person take what we thought belonged to us? We thought we were still big boss, that we could go around, do whatever we wanted. The French too, I think, thought the same. Anthony Eden, the then Prime Minister, was under immense pressure to do something. Tory MPs compared this to the Munich Agreement, which I guess they mean the previous agreements were worth as much as the Munich Agreement was worth, which was nothing. The Labour opposition leader compared Nasser to Hitler and Mussolini, but warned the UK not to take military action. The French were equally mad. There was a fear that Nasser could get the oil nations together and cause the West lots of issues. There was also an agreement made. The British, the French and Israelis come up with a plan. And if we just quickly look at the UK's kind of perspective on this, a nation that just came off rationing, but 2 years prior to this, around that mark, but also the fact that the UK agreed to take the military out of Egypt to kind of placate Nasser, but then Nasser kind of went back on it and nationalised the Suez Canal, which maybe his means weren't the best, but I agree with Egypt having control over the canal and profiting from it. They should get the lion's share, at least. The invasion. So this was where the plan kind of takes fruition. On the 29th of October 1956, Israel begins its military invasion of Egypt. Israel manages to do well against the Egyptian forces. The UK and France offer both sides ultimatums to stop Israeli forces fighting. Israeli forces got to within 10 miles of the Suez Canal, according to the US Office of the Historian. The UK and France pretended to go in as peacekeepers. On the 30th of October, both UK and France sent ultimatums to Egypt and Israel, which makes no sense given that Israel was the aggressor in this conflict. British bombers were sent to destroy Cairo's airport, but were pulled back as Americans were fleeing via that airport. With the UK going for a strategy of aerial superiority, it makes sense to take out the airport, but this was a civilian airport by the looks of it. Maybe it was also used by the military, but if any Americans were killed here, the situation would have gotten way worse. That's a sad indictment of how we value human beings, by nationality. The key parts of the invaders' plans were Israeli forces attacking across Egypt's Sinai Peninsula on the 29th, 1956 of October, advancing to within 10 miles of the canal under the pretext of protecting the canal from the other two belligerents, Britain and France. So Britain and France went in there trying to claim that we're going to protect the canal from the Egyptians and the Israelis. Britain and France landed troops of their own a few days later, according to the US Office of the Historian. This is what I thought happened. I did not realise that British and French forces actually got involved in fighting the Egyptian army and civilians. Crazy that part is just glossed over. The idea that Britain and France sent in peacekeepers to the Suez Canal. That's what I thought originally, but I was obviously very stupid because they were very much fighting with the Egyptian military. When British and French forces fighting against the Egyptians, Nasser changed tactics. He armed civilians, got the military to dress in civilian clothing, which made it hard for the Brits to attack Nasser, as Nasser declared this a people's war. The situation was spiraling out of control, with the US threatening the UK to stand down. So you can see the situation here, right? If we go back quickly, is Israel attacks Egypt. Now, the Egyptian military are fighting back against Israel. The UK and the French go in pretending to be peacekeepers, fly in via with paratroopers to take over the canal, but also start fighting the Egyptian military, which is just wild. So you got Dwight D. Eisenhower, which is the coolest name of any US president by far. He kept a close eye on the situation. He wanted to disassociate the US from European imperialism, which something the Americans did try to do for a long time. The US voted in favour of the UN condemnation of the UK, but also threatened the UK selling off UK bonds. That was the threat. That would tank the UK currency and cause a pensions crisis, which is something we just saw a few weeks ago. The US also thought about oil sanctions, and the UK considered invading Qatar and Kuwait if that happened. And with that thought, you can see how quickly things could have further spiraled out of control, and the UK would have invaded more countries in the quest for control over the Suez Canal. It also shows that despite large parts of the empire declaring independence and going away from the empire, that mindset of imperialism still existed within the government. The situation in the end is that the PM was warned by Harold Macmillan who was the then Chancellor, that if the US sells the bonds within weeks of such a move, the country would be unable to import the food and energy supplies needed to sustain the population, according to Wikipedia. However, there is also the idea that Macmillan overstated what the US said to force out Anthony Eden, as Macmillan later became Prime Minister. So you can see maybe Macmillan was lying here, but if the US had sold off bonds, it would have caused a huge currency crisis. And the UK being very reliant on imports, it would have been a disaster situation, especially as a country that just recently came off of rationing. So the aftermath. Israel managed to get concessions out of Egypt. The former ignored the US and UN condemnations, which they still do now. Egypt kept the canal and has a massively overinflated ego, which they paid for later on. But for the UK, this marked the end of the UK as a superpower. Despite being seen as one of the big three only a decade before, that picture represents a lot. It wasn't that the UK could not beat Egypt, but the fact that Eden seemed to want to limit civilian casualties, which just doesn't fit into an imperial mindset. But more importantly, America with some strong threats made the UK stand down. That the UK currency could tank and cause absolute chaos. Also the fact that we could face oil sanctions, oil being a necessity for the domestic population, but also for the military to run. You need oil for the vehicles. Had the UK decided to invade Kuwait and Qatar, what would that cost? Also the fact that I think people in the UK did not fully accept that the empire was done. Public opinion was on Eden's side initially, but that slowly changed with the Labour Party calling out the Tories on TV debate shows. Although British casualties were very low, in the end, we were going to fight for a canal in a distant place we had no real right to. The war itself lasted for 5 months, but historians conclude the crisis signified the end of Great Britain's role as one of the world's major superpowers. And I agree. The UK was told by the US to stand down or else, and we did. If the US issued the same threat to the USSR, it would not have mattered, hence one of the reasons why we had the Cold War. The UK just didn't have it in us, and it showed that we were not a superpower anymore. That era had ended. The fact that we stood down fairly quickly after what the US threatened us, it does show you the position we were in, and you can't be a world superpower by kind of folding under threats from an actual superpower. And this is why people kind of see the Suez Crisis as the end of an empire, because if we scroll back up to that picture just quickly, you can see it looks very much like a conversation of equals, and it just wasn't. The UK just wasn't a major player. The war had crippled us massively. The USSR gained a lot from World War II. They had massive casualties and other issues, but they gained a massive amount of countries effectively to add to the Soviet Union. The UK lost a lot because the empire was just too expensive to manage. And that's why I think, in my opinion, and an opinion shared by lots of other people, not saying I'm right here, but historians have said that the Suez Canal was the end of the empire. For that reason, is we realised we're not that guy anymore. We're not the top don, and it was a brutal message for the UK to take, I think, where the UK changed tactics a lot after that. We went towards more soft power rather than using hard power, because if you think we invaded a sovereign country that nationalised one of their assets, it's just madness, isn't it? But anyways, look, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Shouts out to the patrons of the members. They'll get early access to these kinds of project videos. And I'll hopefully do one of these once a month, depending on how things go. So if you want early access and to support these kind of endeavours, feel free to kind of pick up a membership or join on Patreon if that's something you want to do. But yeah, I've kind of enjoyed doing this because I've learnt a fair bit covering the Suez Crisis. But yeah, I hope you've learnt something from this, and it's benefited you in some sort of way, because I know the Suez Crisis is mentioned a lot without anyone really explaining what the Suez Crisis really was. But yeah, I wonder if people saw this as the end of the French Empire as well, because they backed out. They backed out as well, so I wonder, it'd be quite interesting, but I'm rambling now. Anyways, let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe, support the channel on Patreon if you can, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.